Most people today hear Dhyana Yoga and think it means something vague, mindfulness during daily activities, or a general attitude of calm. But when Krishna teaches Dhyana Yoga in chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita, he is extremely specific. He gives literal, practical instructions for seated meditation. This is not metaphor. This is not optional. This is the method he prescribes. In the last lesson, we explored Jnana Yoga, the knowledge that frees you from mistaken identity. But here's something traditional teachers have always emphasized. Knowledge alone is not enough. The mind must be steady enough to hold that knowledge. Otherwise, insight flickers and fades. This is exactly why Krishna teaches Dhyana Yoga, to prepare the mind so that understanding becomes stable. Let's look at what Krishna actually says. In chapter 6, verses 11 through 14, he describes the practice in concrete terms. Find a clean, steady seat, not too high, not too low. Sit with the body, head, and neck aligned and still. Fix the gaze, withdraw the senses. Hold the mind steady on a single point. This is not abstract guidance. Krishna is describing formal seated meditation with specific posture, specific conditions, and specific technique. Why does Krishna teach this so explicitly? Because the untrained mind cannot sustain clarity. It cannot practice discernment. It cannot remain steady during action. Dhyana is the discipline that makes everything else possible. Without it, karma yoga becomes reactive. Without it, jnana yoga remains intellectual. Dhyana is not one path among many. It is the foundation that supports them all. Traditional commentators on the Bhagavad Gita have always emphasized this point. Meditation prepares the mind for knowledge. The student practices dhyana not to achieve a special state, but to make the mind steady enough for understanding to remain. Insight without mental steadiness does not last. This is why Krishna does not skip this step. Now let's address verse 626, which is often quoted out of context. Krishna says, "Whenever and wherever the mind wanders, bring it back and place it upon the self." This instruction is powerful, but we must understand where it appears. It comes after Krishna has described the seated posture, the withdrawn senses, the fixed attention. This is not a general life instruction disconnected from formal practice. It is guidance for what to do during meditation when distraction arises. The logic of chapter 6 is clear. The mind is restless. Arjuna admits this directly in verse 34. The mind is turbulent, strong, and hard to control. Krishna does not deny this. He acknowledges the difficulty and then gives the method, repeated practice and dispassion. In verse 35 he says, practice and detachment are what bring the mind under control. Not one moment of insight, not a single realization. Repeated, sustained effort over time. This is where discipline enters the teaching. Krishna is not describing something that happens automatically. He is describing a training. You sit, you withdraw the senses, the mind wanders, you bring it back, it wanders again, you bring it back again. This is the practice. There is no shortcut. The steadiness that eventually arises is the fruit of this discipline, not a starting point, not something you assume into existence. Here is a distinction that matters: quiet mind versus suppressed mind. Krishna is not teaching suppression. Suppression creates tension. It forces the mind into temporary stillness through strain. What Krishna teaches is different. Through repeated return, through patient practice, the mind gradually loses its compulsive momentum. It becomes naturally still, not forced, trained. There is also a difference between discipline and force. Discipline means showing up to the practice consistently. Force means fighting the mind as an enemy. Krishna's approach is firm but not violent. You do not beat the mind into submission. You train it the way you would train a wild horse, with steadiness, patience, and persistence. So where does daily life fit in? This is important to understand correctly. The quietness you bring into daily life is the result of seated practice, not a replacement for it. You sit in meditation. You train the mind to return. Over time, that steadiness begins to show up when you are not sitting, when you are working, when you are speaking, when you are facing difficulty. But this is the fruit of dhyana, not the method itself. Think of it this way. You cannot skip the training and expect the result. A musician practices scales before performing on stage. An athlete trains before competing. In the same way, the meditator sits in formal practice before expecting steadiness in action. Daily life reveals whether meditation has done its work. It is the test, not the technique. Krishna makes this progression explicit. First, discipline, then steadiness. Then, the mind becomes fit for knowledge. Then, that knowledge transforms action. If you try to reverse this order, if you skip seated practice and hope for clarity in daily life, you are working against the structure Krishna has laid out. This is why Chapter 6 matters. It is not an appendix. It is not a concession for those who cannot do Jnana Yoga. It is the necessary preparation. Krishna places it here because without a steady mind, nothing else holds. Let's address some common misunderstandings. Some say, I meditate while I walk, while I work, while I do daily tasks. This may be valuable, but it is not what Krishna is describing. He gives specific seated instructions for a reason. The formal posture and withdrawal create conditions that daily activity cannot replicate. I don't have time to sit. Then begin with 5 minutes. The practice scales, but it must begin. Seated meditation is not an advanced option. It is where the training happens. So what does this mean practically? It means you establish a regular seated practice. You find a quiet place. You sit with steadiness. You fix attention. When the mind wanders, you return it, not with frustration, but with patience. You do this again and again. Over weeks and months, something shifts. The mind becomes less compulsive, the return becomes easier, and gradually that steadiness begins to permeate your life outside of formal sitting. This is exactly what Krishna promises. In verse 627, he describes the yogi whose mind is peaceful, whose passions are calmed, who has become one with Brahman. This is not fantasy. This is the result of sustained practice, and it begins with sitting down. The Bhagavad Gita is not asking you to adopt a philosophy. It is giving you a method. Krishna's teaching of Dhyana Yoga is specific, practical, and grounded. Seated meditation is necessary. Discipline precedes freedom. Daily life clarity is the outcome of practice, not a substitute for it. This is part of a series exploring practical lessons from the Bhagavad Gita. In the previous lesson, we looked at Jnana Yoga and freedom from inner disturbance. Dhyana Yoga is what makes that freedom stable. If you haven't seen the Jnana Yoga lesson, it fits naturally with what we've explored here. Links are in the description. Thank you for practicing with me today. dailyselfwisdom.com